Na le la le lo lo le la la na le la le lo lo la.
Velkommen til RiddoDuottarMuseats sin podcast. I dag så har jeg med meg Liisa-Ravna Finbog og Jeremie McGowan, og vi skal snakke om det med å dekolonisere museer, eller ha sånn veldig vidt perspektiv på det, og det her med decolonizing og indigenizing. Og for å nå ut til et mye større publikum, så vil denne podcasten foregå på engelsk. So welcome Liisa-Ravna and Jeremie. Would you like to introduce yourself first before we start the discussion? Liisa-Ravna.
Very shortly, I am a Sami scholar from the Norwegian side, and I've been working with museums for the last, well, it feels like all my life, but at least for the last decades or so, thinking about precisely these terms, decolonization and indigenization. So this is also what I'm working on a daily basis in Tampere, the University of Tampere on the Finnish side, where I am presently doing my postdoc research.
Thank you. Jeremie.
Yeah, hello. So my name is Jeremie McGowan. I'm a non-Sami designer and researcher, artist. I'm originally from the United States, Wilmington, North Carolina, which is a very colonial place indeed, just like Sápmi, of course, with different histories. But I guess I got an early dose in life of sort of race problematics and these things, and that has maybe continued with me a bit. So yeah, in Norway, since moving to Norway in 2011, that's actually when my museum career, in a sense, started a bit by chance. It wasn't really the plan, but that's where I found post-PhD employment. So I first worked at the National Museum in Oslo of Art, Architecture and Design, and then I was employed as the director at Nordnorsk Kunstmuseum, or Northern Norway Art Museum in Tromsø, from 2016 to 2020. And based on previous experience, starting already from the late 90s that I had as a practicing artist and designer in Sápmi, a lot of things came full circle for me at that time. And then we, of course, Anna May and I and RiddoDuottarMuseats have been working very closely then the past few years on these issues of decolonizing, indigenizing. And then, of course, my role in this has been as an outsider and a contributor, trying to be an ally and trying to think maybe from the, working within Norwegian institutions, also as a non-Norwegian, and trying to make change, and maybe also thinking about what the limits of the possibilities for change making are as well.
Yeah, that's true. And I probably need to introduce myself too, because as a director, people maybe think that I'm working just with administration and that kind of things, but I've actually been working with museums since the mid-90s. I started, and I've been working at a Sami museum since then, and also had my practice. I have this conservator education from University of Oslo, and also had experience working at Kulturhistorisk Museum and also Tromsø Museum. So totally we have a quite good background for doing this kind of discussions, I think. Maybe we should explain what we think about this decolonization, what it actually means. Liisa-Ravna, can you start?
Decolonization as a word is really complex. It's really problematic, I think, because we are taught to think about colonization as being a question of property and ownership over land, right? Whereas for those of us living within that colonial context, and I'm talking especially indigenous peoples that by their very name and definition as indigenous are still being colonized. We are a colonized people. We are living within a process of colonization where someone else is taking our homeland away from us. But in that very huge and problematic context, we have to keep in mind that colonization is also about imposing certain systems and certain ways of viewing the world onto the people that you colonize. So it's not only about taking the land, it's about asserting systems that legitimize that taking, right? And that you can see that's a very insidious process happening in all aspects of society. So museums, of course, is a part of that. Let's talk about, for instance, what the institution of museum is actually a symptom of, because museums were established in this, in the 16th and 17th century, where Western discoverers, and I'm using that term, also a very problematic term, but where Western people traveled and discovered new places as if no one existed before the white man came. But, and in that process, they brought home to demonstrate what they had discovered and witnessed. And those things eventually became the foundation of the modern museum as we know it. So when we talk about museums today, even in indigenous contexts, so indigenous museums, what we are talking about is a structure that essentially was seeded with the process of colonization. So that means that when we work within museums, we also, when you adapt museum structures, you are actually adapting one of the tools of the imperialists when they colonized what is today, for instance, Sápmi. So decolonization then comes into that very problematic context as a way to try and narrow down some of the strategies that we might employ to, to sort of declaw these insidious tactics and strategies born from colonization, if that makes sense. I don't know if it does, because personally, I am not a huge fan of museums. There is a reason why I am working in academic institutions doing research on museum rather than working within the museum structure. And it's precisely because I feel very conflicted with the structure of museum in general. But anyway, for me, that is, in one way to talk about decolonization.
Jeremie, what's your understanding of decolonization in the context with what Liisa-Ravna has put on the table?
Yeah, great. Thanks for that, Liisa-Ravna, for setting a bit of a tone and a framework. I guess maybe what I agree with most of what you said there, and I guess what I would add as well, I think as part of this, also the dynamics of what we're at least trying to get our teeth into here today together, is also this part of the problem, as well as the way in which this word decolonization has maybe start standing in for all sorts of other things as well. And that's then maybe the problems within academia, so that the museums have their problems, and then in academia, this has become a very trendy sort of code word, buzzword, and it gets critique as well. But in a sense, it just starts standing in for all sorts of undefined, maybe slightly ambiguous social justice movements, which aren't necessarily aligned with, they might even be conflicting movements. So that it also very quickly gets the sort of the potential of decolonizing, and what we might read into that as a revolutionary sort of truly like a paradigm shifting or a taking back act, gets very quickly watered down as well, so that everybody starts talking about decolonization, and it becomes very much maybe small, it dead ends in tokenism maybe very quickly. And so we have to be careful about that as well. So what are we actually doing? And for me, I guess, I understand what Liisa-Ravna is saying about museums and being conflicted around that. And I think it's very interesting to get concrete about things. So my experiences, for example, working with Norsk Kunstmuseum, that of course, everything Liisa-Ravna said, as an example. Then we have these institutions that get founded, in the case of Northern Norway Art Museum, founded in 1985. So not from the 1700s. It's a post, in a Sápmi context, a post-Alta controversy institution. And even so, then it I would argue takes on a very colonial role, and of course that's then, some people want to talk about post-colonial, and of course most people in Sápmi, it's as Liisa-Ravna said, it's an ongoing colonial thing. And a museum like Norsk Kunstmuseum, I would argue, is evidence of that ongoing colonial move, right? So there was a potential maybe also for a majority institution, a Norwegian institution founded in 1985. We could have hoped that institution also could have been something other than what it was. But no, it gets established as a sort of majority stakeholder or something to uphold these colonial trajectories as well. So there's clearly a lot of work to be done. So we have to avoid like the easy like metaphorization of the word, so it doesn't get just watered down and become meaningless. And then we also have it's that balancing act also between, you know, trying to work within structures when we can and working without when, yeah. And of course, I don't profess to have the answers here either, but I wanted to add that in to make our work even trickier, to add in that warning note of the watering down tendency.
That's true. And also thinking of that, us been working at a Sami institution for so long time, and actually just learning about this decolonization or this need to indigenize now. But actually the museum was, Sami Workadavras was established in 1972, it's 50 years this year. And in the beginning, we were working with and using our own knowledge, language, tradition in the museum kind of work. But after a while, it was asked questions. Are you actually good enough museums if you're not working within this museum, what do you call it, acceptable level of, or this academic kind of museum practices? And that was quite interesting because when I have been working with this conservation, that I wanted to use our own knowledge in the conservation work instead of the academic, because I also experienced that our objects actually have better results using traditional knowledge than using this academic knowledge that I have. And in that perspective, it was quite interesting to see that the museum was built on this Sami way of thinking and our own traditions, but then they got the knowledge that, well, if you're not working in this accepted strategies, then you are not a good enough museum, then you are not working as a museum, then you are something else. And then learning about words that has been more used now than before, like indigenizing. But actually we were not indigenizing, we were trying to build a structure that the rest of the world could recognize and actually then be able to invest, because we needed the money, we needed to build it, we needed the Norwegian state's blessing for do this, and then we needed to build something that they could recognize and understand. But we needed also to be the people that we are in that process and in the work we were doing, and also be a part with the society, the indigenous society, but also the majority society, like preserving, but not only preserving, you need to try to make this understanding on the Sami people or the Sami way of thinking. So being a Sami institution in a Norwegian system and trying to be indigenous inside of the frames, that is quite interesting sometimes. And then when we're talking about the way that we are working, I have been actually in meetings and I have heard that I'm kind of a museum activist because I only try to be me or try to use our own language, our own tradition and technology, and then I'm an activist. And I react on that in a kind of not surprised. It's probably the normal state to be questioned all the time. Think that, well, they are thinking about this decolonizing or colonizing. The Norwegian system is not thinking that actually they are being colonized, because they are taking the information or this academic from abroad into the Norwegian school system and colonize the minds of the youth that is going to be working at the museums afterwards. So I also see this conflict between the indigenous way of thinking and this majority way of thinking that actually are a colonized way of thinking, because the students are not taking care of their own traditions, the Norwegian traditional way of thinking or technology or traditions. They are being colonized in the university systems. So this is a big picture, or big, what do you call it, lerret å bleke in Norwegian. So what are you, Liisa-Ravna, thinking when I'm saying that the university system is actually a part of this colonization problem?
Yeah, I mean, I have so many thoughts when listening to you speak, because I mean, first of all, I think we have to recognize that the world we live in, and it doesn't matter if you're indigenous or if you're not, the world we live in is a colonial world. So the structures that has built the society, the system that we work and function within, that has been established through a process of colonization. So colonization impacts on everything, including academia. But I'll get back to that a little bit later, because I wanted to talk about this. And again, we go back to what I was saying earlier, that museum is a colonial structure, because as you know, I've been working for many years now doing research on Sami museums and how they develop. And what we can clearly see is a very distinctive pattern that initially the local population within a community come together and they realize they need something to strengthen their cultural expressions and aspects. And so they found a museum. But in the beginning, they're not funded by public, they don't receive public funding. So everything is being managed on a voluntary basis by the local community. And they build up using their knowledge. And so this is the knowledge, that we see within a Sami world. What I mean by saying that is that initially the people that established Sami museums very often were not museologists. They were not, culture workers. They were not anthropologists. They were not trained within the scholarly disciplines that very often come with museum practice. So they did what they knew. And what they knew were precisely what you were mentioning, Anna-Mai, using their Sami knowledge. So they use their doyarat, the people that work with Sami material culture. They sort of made up these wonderful connections and institutions, beautiful institutions. And the local people often felt that they had ownership, they had a stake in that institution. But then comes this process of, when you are trying to become acknowledged as a museum, you want to have funding to do more. You want to have funding, especially to safeguard the cultural expressions. And to do that, there are certain criteria that you need to meet. Those criteria, not only are they distinctively colonial, they are actually, I would say, in a way, you could say that those criteria are a danger to Sami knowledge and Sami epistemology, so systems of knowledge. And let's go back to that a little bit, because when you are talking about how academia, how universities are spaces of colonialism, you're absolutely right. There is this beautiful article by Ravna Kokkanen where she employs the term epistemic ignorance. And so what she's talking about is how the systems of knowledge in the Western world, so the Western epistemology, is in a way based on excluding and marginalizing other ways of knowing, so other epistemologies and knowledge systems. And if we go to Sápmi, what we see is that we have many knowledge systems. We do have Sami epistemologies, one of which is the practice of Doitji. That means that in our context, the academics in Sápmi are those that work and practice Doitji, so doyarat. So these are the people we would ideally employ within our practice of museology, because these are the people that hold the knowledge of working with the material culture that we find in museums. But because the system is set up as it is, because we are living in a colonial world where colonial values and meanings is sort of what structures how museums are supposed to function, we are often forced to go away or sort of remove those practices in the museum. We are forced to, become efficient, become more museological, and that basically means becoming more colonial, like taking on these colonial structures. So this is a huge problem. And I think what is interesting when you talk about your experiences of being labeled as an activist, because the same thing happens to me all the time. People talk about me as if I'm an activist. No, but I'm not an activist. because you have to remember that what you are doing, Anna-May, in your context, what I am doing in my context, so what you're doing in the museum, what I'm doing within academia, is we are establishing our space as one of dissonance within colonial structures. So we are forcing our way into a colonial structure, and we are creating, we are rupturing those structures, or at least trying our best. So we are trying to shift the established or the establishment. That makes you an activist. That makes you you're doing the revolution or whatever. So I understand why people outside of our context would label us activists for the work that we do, because the work that we do are founded in the knowledges and practices of our people. And those knowledges and practices have been deemed lesser by the colonial structure and the colonial knowledge systems, right?
It's true that you're saying. It's like we are coming into a system and we are just making some waves, and it's not that wanted wave. It's more like something they don't want to have. It's like we are touching into something that is painful or shameful or something like that. It's like they don't want to be recognized in that system or being a part of that. And that's quite interesting to see how people are reacting when we are talking, and see how people are responding to what we are saying and what we are working with. And by doing that, we are actually learning a lot, not necessarily about us, the Sami people, but about the structures and how things are built, and that we actually need to work against the generations to come. I think it's too late with the older ones. It's already it's done. So I see that the schooling system and how we are working are quite important. And Jeremie, listening to us, you have the experience of sitting on the outside looking in some cases when you started to work within the Sami issues, or what we can call it. I'm curious, as an American, been working in Finland and in Norway, and know also with the Sami issues, what are your thoughts about what we are talking about?
Yeah, well, as you guys both know, I very quickly get branded as an activist or a radical or a troublemaker or all sorts of other things. And like both of you, it's sort of, you think, oh, you want radical, I'll give you radical, because this isn't even close to being radical. And I guess it's maybe a slightly indirect answer to your question. But one of the things I think about, and that utterly confuses me, and gets me a bit down as well, is of course it's not being naive. I can very genuinely say, in the work that I was trying to do, which then gets pegged as revolutionary, radical, activist, disruptive, all these things, it was actually an honest and direct attempt to answer to what also the Norwegian museum politics say they are privileging and wanting their museums to work with inclusion, diversity, democracy, all these great words that have been kicking about in the Norwegian sector specifically since at least the early 2000s, have popped up in multiple white papers, official documents published by the Ministry of Culture, ratified by the Parliament, that museums are meant to be working in all these ways. And then when you actually do that, then you're a radical and an activist and all these things. So I think that's one perspective I definitely take with me. And of course it's disruptive because, as we know, power just wants to reassert power. I think there's very little actual dedication to change and change making, despite a whole lot of promising words both in the Norwegian museum sector and also the museum sector internationally. So one of the terms I have found useful is this idea of the resilient museum, right? That it will talk about repatriation, it will talk about inclusion, about access, but it's not. The resilient museum is just very clever at changing its rhetoric and sounding and playing the part, but it doesn't really want to give up power or authority or surrender land and these things. So we can see, I guess again, to try to talk about concrete things in a Norwegian context, our National Museum, and of course I work mostly in the art sector, the National Museum is now already getting mileage and good press that apparently the first thing we will see when we come to the new National Museum will be Marit Amnesada's pile of Sápmi, the curtain of skulls hanging. And it's like, okay, yeah, that's great. Way long overdue. And is that it? is that really it? So are we not going to talk about when is the National Museum even going to start having a discussion about whether they maybe should possibly have a Sami curator? I mean, come on. And these are not hard changes to make. These are like, if they just looked at best practice elsewhere, they would, and then is it so easy to sell this narrative to the rest of the world of sort of, does that mean that now the National Museum is taking decolonization seriously? That they hang up one piece of work on a wall in a central space, but there's no change of structures, no change of, what about their 900 million a year in funding? Is that being channeled? I mean, imagine the things you could do to support all the local upstart initiatives in Sápmi with just some of that funding, right? That might look more like real change or an attempt to share power or surrender power. So I think we have to talk about these things as well. And for me, I guess with that the design background I have, I'm maybe trained in seeing things, also simplifying things or trying to pinpoint things. And that often becomes uncomfortable for power or the power holders to be confronted with, in a sense, simple truths. And then to speak those truths becomes a disturbing thing. And then you get dismissed as being an activist and a disruptor and these things. But then, of course, we have to keep doing that work, and we have to normalize this, what I would say, the sort of type of so-called activist work we might be engaging in. That has to get normalized so we can take a little baby step forward. So, and that we can, if we could eventually get to real activism and real radicalism, that would look very different than what we're getting labeled as now. Because, as I've said before many times, some of the work we did around with the Sami Museum project at Norsk Kunstmuseum, that my argument has always been that was at best dragging an institution into the 1980s, bringing it back to where it should have started in 1985, right? So that's what's that, a 40-year time lag? So we're being activist and radical when we're sort of doing these future projection scenarios, but it's actually a back to the future. We're going back and trying to reconceive something as it should have been in the 1980s, But we have to do the work, and we can't let it get us down. We have to keep going and have to have some hope that real activism and radicalism might come along in a few years down the line.
Can I ask a question though? Because what you were saying earlier, Jeremie, about how decolonization, processes of decolonization so often runs the risk of becoming about tokenism, right? Because it's interesting how, when Anna-May and I are labeled activists, it's almost expected of us because we are Sami. So of course we will protest because, regardless of whether you recognize or you publicly recognize the power dynamics within the context of Sápmi and Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia, and any colonial nation, you do realize that it's there, it is clearly there. You recognize that. So there's this kind of, well, of course, these activists, because that's what they do, ha, ha, ha. But when you, Jeremie, are being an activist, because you are, you're white, you're male, you're a person of privilege within the structure, like the colonial structure and hierarchies. So do you think that quite often then when you are being labeled as an activist, that's a more insidious labeling, because then they are also pointing out that you are kind of going against the establishment, against the system, so against what should be your, clique, if you get my meaning.
Yeah, I get you. And there's an extra layer of insidiousness there as well, because I often, when people have raised this issue, oh, you're being so activist and doing this work that you're doing, there's also a big danger as well that I become a sort of savior or a tool of redemption for the majority structure, right? That especially for Nordic peoples, Norwegians, that, oh yeah, Jeremie, you saw these things because you came from the outside. And then I don't want to give people that easy way out. It's like the get out of jail free card, that like, oh, Is it that easy? No, it's sort of like if you have to, you in the same way that you choose to see things, you choose not to see things. So this sort of blindness. So like you said that with the Rona and the epistemic ignorance, right? Because of course what that leads to, as we know, is epistemicide, which is you were talking, it's about land, but it's also about the knowledge system, and it's the removal of people from land, and it's the removal of knowledge systems. It's the killing off of knowledge systems, right? So of course, like, and it's always, I get what you're saying there, because I have that reaction as well, this sort of being called an activist. So often there's this aftertaste of sort of just being patronized. You're being sort of acknowledged and fobbed off at the same time in one evil move. You're sort of are being patted on the head as a good little activist, and then you're like rendered irrelevant by that label as well. And that's of course a difficult dynamic, and people don't want to hear about these changes. And maybe people in positions of real power as well, they don't want to be given these examples of what change might look like, because then their complicity in not changing becomes that much more apparent.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point. And it's also, when we think about what does decolonization mean? Because decolonization is not just about systems or like institutions and people arguing that they're, we understand diversity, we applaud diversity, we give space to diversity. And that's with decolonization, as I see it happening in today, my problem with decolonization is so often that it is never the people that has been the most affected by colonization that are asked to take lead. Right? We often, we're invited into projects, and then we're kind of sidelined because God forbid that we actually be the one leading the charge, And I think it's interesting, you're talking about the white savior, the white, the person that comes in and saves and makes everything perfect, because it's not only about the white savior within these institutions, someone that the institution can look to and say, but look, we are decolonizing. Look, we have the white savior in our midst. Like, we are so great. But it's also about the white savior coming into our communities, the Sami communities, and sort of, no, but my vision for the future of Sápmi is this and this and that. And then the problem is that if your vision, if a Sami person's vision of the future does not, align with the vision of the white savior, they become a problem, and then they are marginalized, because even in these contexts, the power is never in our hands,
Yeah, I get you totally. It's sort of like this. I like the terms with incommensurability, right? That is sort of like Anne Mai and I think I can say that we consider ourselves to be friends, and we've worked closely together. We've tried to work in the same direction. I've tried to keep things pretty simple and tried to be honestly that I listen to what Anne Mai says. So like with the Sami RiddoDuottarMuseats project, Anne Mai said, here's a clear problem we have with the lack of a Sami art museum. So that was the only intention, or my role in that was, okay, what can we do to talk about that, what you want to talk about, right? And I hope that it's a tricky thing, because I hope that if I continue working together with projects and people and ideas in Sápmi, that I will manage to keep doing that, sort of just listening and helping with what other people have defined as the problem, instead of, as you say, coming in and, because there could, I guess I always try to just keep that exercise going mentally, as that there could come a moment where Anne Mai and I, what we've been working on together, we reach a point where those things no longer match each other. And then I need to really get out of the way, right? That would be the only thing to do with that, like that sort of working towards a Sami art museum in this way is no longer compatible with the actual needs of Sápmi, or of what Anne Mai might say it is. And then it's the sort of change tack to get out of the way. and not be, not have a leadership position. And so this, I think this idea of incommensurability is very important. And we know that from other situations as well, like with Trask in the Hawaii, that sort of, as we know, sort of feminism and indigenous needs and aren't necessarily the same thing in certain contexts, and to never forget that we might, despite friendships and personal interactions, there might be incompatible agendas as well at some point.
Jeremie, do you remember when we started to working together that some of the critics to our project actually didn't came to me? They actually went to Jeremie to tell him about all the problems, why the Sami Art Museum haven't been built yet. I don't know how to say that in English, but it seems like they needed to explain something to Jeremie because he didn't have this knowledge about the Sami people. So he needed to get some knowledge from others, from the Norwegian society or the museum society. And Jeremie, do you remember how you reacted on that?
Yeah, if I'm remembering the same thing as what you're referring to, yeah, it was a bit these sort of, conversations in the wings or sort of sideline conversations where I would, be taken aside to be like, educated in what the real issues are. Like the real reason there is not a Sami art museum still today after 50 years is because, those pesky Sami people, they're always arguing amongst themselves, these sort of like quite horrible things. And of course, I wasn't able to just take that and not respond. So I often pushed back quite strongly. So is what you're saying to me is that there's only internal conflicts among Sami people that doesn't happen in other cultures. So this idea that all Sami people should always agree on all things, right? So, and I hear a lot today now, there's a lot of murmurings in the museum world, in the cultural politics in the Nordic countries, in whatever, there's always discussion. There's not a general homogeneous idea of things. That's what culture is. Culture is dynamic. And when I often meet those murmurings with very straightforward, like, no, I'm not buying that, and I'm not going to participate in this type of conversation, which I find very problematic. And then people get insulted very quickly and get a bit offended when you then take that clear stand and say, no, I'm not going to participate in this type of discussion.
No, but that's actually touching upon a very large problem in indigenous context in general, because it's always this, one of the ways that you could legitimize the sealing of indigenous lands was, of course, to talk about indigenous people as lesser. But when it comes to, our evolution, we were just arrested in development. We didn't have the qualities needed to sort of advance past our present stage. So this idea of us being static people frozen in time has, it's generated essentialism, that we are always expected to agree on anything. And this is, it's such a toxic image. It's such a toxic expectation and perspective, but it is also so incredibly dangerous. I remember a few years back, I was attending a seminar on extractive industries, and one of the people there who represented Statoil, or it was at that time called Statoil, and he talked about the problem of working within South America, because you could go into an area that was interesting for development from a Western company, and then you would have to deal with, say, 10 communities, indigenous communities. And then this guy actually had the audacity to say to all of these people sitting there, many of them many of us were indigenous, and the problem then of course becomes that if 9 communities says no, what about that one community that says yes? How do we fix that? And it's like, okay, listen, man. If in any other context in a colonial Western country or nation, if you had a problem, say a highway is going to be built, I don't know, somewhere in Norway, and you have 10 municipalities that would be affected. If 9 of those municipalities says no, it doesn't matter if the 10th says yes, because Western communities, Western countries, Western structures and systems are allowed democracy. We are not. right? And this is a problem that is used against us again and again and again. Because if there is disagreement amongst us, which, it's the case in all cultures that there are disagreements, that's just one example of us not having reached that elevated state where we are able to function as civilized people, meaning function as a Western society. So the racism in that thought and the people that came to you, Jeremie, and like had to explain to you the problems and issues, essentially these people were racists. Yeah, and we should never listen to them anyway.
And one of my tactics has been I like to pull my North Carolina card, because North Carolina, for those of you that don't know, that's proper Bible Belt, southern US, extremely racist. And one of my maybe best unsettling tactics that I use in these type of conversations is to say, that starts sounding a lot like what I'm familiar with from North Carolina. And that unsettles a lot of Nordic people much more than like trying to talk about structural racism in Sápmi. When you actually say, this looks, I'm familiar with this from a sort of Bible Belt deep South situation. That's the type of things people say there. That sort of seems to sort of strike home in interesting ways. And of course, people get very offended. But yeah, that's to call out that racism when it comes is very important. And then again, you get dismissed as being a radical. You're not soft enough and round enough around the edges.
Yeah, and in that context, I think it's really important. Like, personally, I'm not a huge fan of the word ally, because I feel ally is I had the privilege of talking to Sean Wilson once, who wrote about, research as ceremony. And he said something really interesting. He said, an ally is someone that, when the going gets tough, they can leave. They're not bound to the conflict in the same way. An accomplice, on the other hand, they don't leave. They remain in the problem, in the context, no matter what. Like, for me, very often the difference is that an ally is someone that very often is performative. They want to be seen to support diversity and these very important issues. But when they're asked to actually make a difference, that's when they sort of silently vanish, because that's not really interesting.
Yeah, so like to take a stand, to actually take a risk, to put something online yourself that might have consequences for you in your life, and then you duck out of and disappear quietly.
Exactly. But also, and I think this is really, really important, this is key, I think, in every context where we work, whether we work within a Sami context exclusively or whether we work collaboratively with other contexts and cultures, the ability to listen, to just hear what is being said. I've been working in so many different projects with different people, and this thing where, when you go into a meeting and you say to someone, look, listen to what I'm saying to you right now, this is not good. What you're proposing right now, yes, there will be some benefit from it, but long term, the harm will be much worse. But still, the person, for them, it's all about, but I need to be seen doing this. I need to be a good ally. I need to make the decision. So just, the ability to listen. That's actually one of the things that I like about you, Jeremie, when we have conversations, is that, you always talk a lot, which I like because I do the same, but you also have the ability to just shut up and listen when needed. And that's difference between an ally and an accomplice. That is what in Sami I would term a verde, like someone that is not only a friend, but also kin, aligned to the process of decolonization, of indigenization, of, land back, to just toss that in as well, but without needing to take the lead, without needing to be the person in charge. And I think that's really important, because I'm sick of these white people coming in wanting to help and be so, friendly and, oh, we're going to revolutionize the world. Everything is going to be beautiful. And then when it comes to like deciding, but who is going to make the tough decisions? Who is in charge? Well, of course, that needs to be me because I'm essentially a racist. So I think that because I am white and Western, I am better suited to make the decisions because you poor Sami people sometimes don't know your own best, right? Do you know what I mean? And maybe I'm very harsh and critical, and maybe I'm sounding a little bit bitter, but it gets to you when these are the kind of coalitions that you enter again and again and again, where what you're saying, where your culture, where your opinions, where the value of your people is again and again sidelined because someone in a museum is really not interested in decolonizing in truth, but rather they want to be seen as someone that is aligned with the process of decolonization. So again, tokenism, like you said, was saying earlier, Jeremie.
Yeah. And what I hear there as well, it's sort of this, the nightmare scenario, which is a very real scenario, is that maybe a lot of decolonizing, in fact, is just a new form of colonizing again.
Yeah.
Like McGowan is doing very excellent work writing about the truth and reconciliation processes in Sápmi, and the very real danger that all of that is just another form for settler ignorance and settler privilege and reclaiming settler past and futures in the name of something that appears or gets pawned off as decolonization. And that's maybe one of the big dangers. That's one of the big dangers we're facing then,
And this is actually why I prefer indigenization or like we have a term for it in Sami, we use Saamalaisten. I prefer that to decolonization because decolonization is a process that needs you to work within colonial structures, whereas indigenization, Saamalaisten, is a process where you ground yourself in Sápmi, you ground yourself in the land, in the relations, in the system of kinship, and you work from that point. You work from that collective understanding and that collective togetherness. And I think it's desperately needed. And especially when we talk about indigenous museums, like institutions for cultural heritage that we have established within indigenous communities, it's not always so much about decolonization as it is about asserting the knowledges and values of your people. That for me is not decolonization. That for me is indigenization, going in and just spawning everything that is beautiful about our cultures and our philosophies within that space.
I also think that indigenization is actually being allowed to use our own language, our own technology, our own way of doing things. And it's more like, for me, it's as a director of Sami museums, it's not that I'm not indigenizing a Sami museum. I'm just trying to be us. In the work I'm doing, I'm just trying to let us be us in this frame of being a museum. And I also think that decolonizing as a word for me means that if we are going to decolonize, then we have to talk about to be equal, actually going to be listened to, and we are going to be able to be speaking, and we are also being the part that are included in the decisions. If we are not, it's not decolonizing, then it's still colonizing. So it's like, it's what you put in the meanings of the words, and I think that the discussion between you guys actually is showing that in a good way, or people that are listening to this actually can get this understanding of what we actually mean with what are decolonizing and what is indigenizing. And we are not trying to decolonize or indigenize at all. As I started, that is words that we never have used before. It's something that has come the last couple of years. We are just trying to be us as a people inside this institution that is recognized as a museum. And for me, it's quite difficult to talk about that in one way, because it's like talking about, but I'm just trying to be me in my work. I just try to let everybody that works at our museums is able to be themselves and not become something else because they are working in an institution. And also to take the values that we have. I'm saying that the Sami museums has a way of thinking that I really like. We often experience that it's time to do something, and you just have to do that. It's like it's in our blood. It's like as a reindeer herder, you know that when the reindeers are in the corral, you need to let everything else just be, and you're going to the corral doing that kind of work that you have to do there, and then go back and pick up what you were doing and continue with that. And that is also the mentality as a farmer. So it's like you're reading the nature, you're reading things around you that have to be in the right timing, and you know what to prioritize. And that is not indigenizing. It's not decolonizing in practice. And I don't think that other institutions can talk about decolonization if we as a people is not equal. If we are not equal, they are not decolonizing. To summing up on what the word decolonizing actually means, and also this indigenizing. And I'm saying for me, colonizing is like being equal. And indigenizing is like accepting that others have different ways. And it's equal. It's not less or more. It's equal, and just accept it, and don't bother. Don't make any mess of it. I have to say that in English. But what do you guys think about the words to sum it up?
Well, I actually think you had a very nice way of summing it up, because on the one hand, decolonization is something that happens within these very colonial structures. And what we've been talking about today, and especially like this idea of epistemic ignorance and the hierarchy of groups and people that we find within colonial structures, that needs to be dealt with. We need to handle that difficult issue. So very much decolonization is about making us equal, and decolonization. And it's interesting, because for me, decolonization is not so much about being allowed to, but more about you take your right, because that is a basic human right. It is your right to be able to breathe as a free person in your way, in your own way of living. And now, that's of course a good way of putting it. So I think, I very much agree with how you summarized it, Anna-May. I also think that what you're saying about, decolonization and indigenization, that you don't think about what it is you're doing, you're just doing it. That's of course because, as I was saying initially, like these terms have been made to fit within the colonial structure that labels everything, that need labels on everything, because that's the only way things make sense. That's the only way you can make order and structure of the world. Of course, that order and structure is colonial, but never mind. But yeah, no, I think I have this thing that I very often say when people like talk to me or asks me about how I feel about indigenous sovereignty. And for me, indigenous sovereignty is, being calm and being able to breathe safe and comfort in your own bodily autonomy, safe and comfortably in your land, And I think indigenization very much refers to that state of mind, being calm, breathing, and just doing what it is that we have always done and that we continue to do, despite all of these annoying interventions by colonial structures, and also annoying interventions by Norwegians, Swedes, Finns, and Russians.
Yeah, so I guess I'm not going to add too much to what you guys say, except maybe make that like a basic sort of call to action for the need for continuing practices and actions. And that's, I guess, maybe one of our starting points on the May, you and I, in all of this, and a piece of this conversation that I would like to round off with is that we do need, clear, concise, concerted, honest attempts at change making from different perspectives and point of view, and to attempt to do the work and really do the work, and not just on paper, but to actually test drive action, because there's no one right answer, there's no one model, There needs to be different actions in different times and places and contexts. And we need people brave enough and willing enough to do that and to maybe think less about theory and more about action.
With that, I will say thank you so much.
Na